Join me for a conversation with game designer Jason Tondro.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. I thank you so much for listening today, and I have an amazing guest. So let's just not waste any more time today. Here's the interview. My guest today is a former English professor. He is also a developer on the Starfinder team at Paizo. Jason Tondro. Jason, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
When were you first introduced to tabletop role-playing games?
Okay, so I'm trying to do the math in my head. You'd think I would know this by now. I think it was around 1980. The Player's Handbook was not out yet. I heard about this thing called the Dungeons and Dragons Club, and I didn't know anything about it. And but I knew about the chess club, and this is being put on by the same people that did the chess club. So I thought it was some kind of weird chess variant, like the castles were the dungeons, and like maybe the knights were the dragons or something. I don't know. So I go to the Dungeons and Dragons Club, and they're playing white box D&D. And that was kind of my introduction. And the first thing I bought was not the red box that most people think of, but like the version of basic Dungeons and Dragons a couple of boxes previous to that. So, and as I say, the Player's Handbook hadn't come out yet. And I remember getting that as soon as it did come out and trying to find a way to because I didn't really realize I had two different games. I had Advanced Dungeons and Dragons in the Player's Handbook, and I had basic D&D in the box set. And I couldn't figure out why they weren't the same. Like they see, we would not do that today. We spend a lot of time making clear, what's the beginner box or a basic set versus, and we're a lot more attentive to the way that we can confuse new players. But at the time I was pretty confused. I think I was around 12 years old about 12.
Okay.
Younger.
And so what captured your imagination about Dungeons and Dragons?
Well, it was a thing that I was doing with my friends. And there's a lot. It's interesting. It's a good question. There's a lot of, sort of ways that different people play. Different people play role-playing games for different reasons. Mm-hmm. And at first, I think I was a buddy gamer. That is, I was doing it because my friends were doing it.
Okay.
But I pretty rapidly got into the world creation. And that really, it became a creative outlet for me, and it became a rainy day activity for me. Like I had a stepbrother, and my stepbrother and I would play, and we literally made a character of every single class in the Player's Handbook, and I would DM, and my brother would play all 10 of them. Right. And it was just kind of a thing to do. And I didn't have a lot of friends, and I didn't really get out much. I was a nerd playing with my Legos and stuff. And D&D was a creative outlet for me. And I would grab some hex paper and go to the McDonald's, and I would draw maps for hours,
Yeah. Having a similar experience about being a nerd.
Yeah. I suspect a lot of people that are listening to this know what I'm talking about. It was a different world then. We weren't as connected to everybody as we are now with social media,
Yeah. No.
So,
yeah.
So if you didn't have a television in your bedroom, and I didn't, mm-hmm. then you were it was just you and the books,
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I know it is a different world because if you didn't live in a subdivision, you didn't have friends nearby on a rainy day. Like I didn't live in a subdivision. So if it was a rainy day, I was doing Dungeons and Dragons in my room, by myself.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned you had started being the game master there for your brother. Did that kind of continue then throughout like your teen years and all that you were running games?
I played a lot. I would GM a lot. By the time I got to high school, I was kind of the GM guy. Now, by that time, I'd kind of transitioned out of D&D. Champions, the superhero role-playing game, came out pretty soon after, and I picked up Champions, and I kind of left D&D for a long time. Like I actually never played second edition D&D. I was playing Champions that whole time, my undergraduate college years and stuff like that. And I was mostly the GM, but I played when I could. I enjoy playing. I have some bad habits as a player. I tend to get a little competitive, and that's not good. So I need my fellow players to help me out with that. But I GM'd probably most of the time, and we trying out a lot of different games. And it was often for me about the creative outlet. I mean, even if I'm playing, I'm that guy who writes a 20-page novella for your character background, right? So, so I enjoyed the world building and the creative aspect. And for me, that as a GM, that's easy to get out of my system. As a player, it manifests as I come up with 12 different character concepts for every game I'm in, right? And and it's a matter of which one I come up with last is the one I usually end up playing.
Yeah, I kind of have that problem too. When I get a chance to play, I start making up new character concepts, and then they just get better, right? I mean, it's just this one's better. I got a better one. One.
For me, I don't even know if they're better. They're just shiny. And it's testament to a lot of these games because the game is so great. Like, I'm just starting to play in a new Pathfinder 2nd edition campaign, and I'm flipping through the rule book, and I mean, I helped edit that book, so I know it fairly well. But there's like new awesome character concepts on every page. I'm like, I want to play this guy, and I want to play this other character, and I really want to try a wizard, but shouldn't I not play the wizard for once, right? So, a good game can really make you come up with a long list of character concepts.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Every time I read through the D&D 5e player's handbook, I just want to make a new character.
It's true.
Yeah.
And the world settings and the new subclasses and stuff. Like I was reading Rime of the Frost Maiden, and I'm like, I would love to play some, cause like I have this old family connection to a guy who was like a dog sledder up in Alaska. And I would make that guy. I would make like my great uncle, I can't believe I've forgotten his name. But anyway, the Malamute Kid, I would play him, and anyway.
Since you have run a lot of games, do you have any advice for people who are maybe just starting out running games?
Oh gosh. Well, if you're I don't know how many people listening to this are just starting, but I'll give you what advice I can. And you're going to hear my dogs rampaging in the background. They have now decided that it's their time to shine.
Okay, awesome.
So first off, don't be intimidated by the book or what other people might be telling you, or you're going to find your own way. So trust the game and have fun with it. Second, don't be intimidated by shows that you might see, streaming shows where everyone is incredibly funny and well prepared and good looking, and they've got all the best props, right? And the game just runs perfectly smoothly from minute 1 to minute 120. Like games don't go like that, right? Those are packaged entertainment, and most of us are just not that funny. So don't be surprised. Don't feel like you have these incredibly high expectations to meet. GMing is a muscle, and you're going to get better at it the more you do. Yeah. Read a lot. Read a lot of the game. Read outside of the game. A lot of things that I know that I have learned, I learned because I was GMing a game. If I'm running a game right now that's set on 13th century Malta, and I've got a stack of books about 13th century Malta that you would not believe, research can be a lot of fun. You can take gaming as an opportunity to learn. So it becomes reward. And this leads to another point. Remember that you are also a player, that everybody needs to be having fun, and that includes you. You don't want to overshadow the player characters. Don't include character of your own that starts doing everything better than the player characters need to do, right? Don't do that. Mm-hmm. But run a game that you are enjoying, that you're going to have fun with. We could go on for ages and ages. I'll tell you what. Okay, I'll shut up after one last thing. Read Robin's Laws of Good Game Mastering. It's a relatively short, like I think maybe 40 pages, little soft cover book written by Robin Laws on GMing advice. It's published by Steve Jackson Games. It's not for beginners. It's for people that have already been GMing a little while. But it's the best one-volume quick advice on GMing that I've read.
Maybe I'll link to that in the show notes for this episode, so everyone can check that out.
He's been doing a lot of work on this. Robin Laws is a longtime game designer. He's a legend in the industry. Yeah. Everybody probably knows him already. But a lot of what's in that book was first drafted for the DMG2. Do you remember when 4th edition was coming out and Wizards was putting out like Monster Manual 2, Player's Handbook 2, DM's Guide 2? Mm-hmm. There's this big section on GMing advice at the beginning of that book, and it's kind of a D&D specific version of the advice in his separate book. So yeah, I recommend that. That's a good place to go.
Okay. And they can also check out my the No Prep Game Master, a little book that I wrote.
Oh, great. Well, that's a great title.
Yeah.
Because a lot of us don't have time for that stuff.
No. I mean, that's why I wrote it, right? I mean, you got, jobs, families, other, social responsibilities, all kinds of other stuff. Yeah. I mean, you just don't have time. Yeah. So absolutely. So now, I mentioned, of course, in the intro that you are working with Paizo, but that was not always the case, right? You took another path, right?
Yeah, I was a college professor for many years. I finished my PhD in 2008 in English literature. My specializations were in medieval and Renaissance literature and also in superhero comic books. And I wrote a book called Superheroes of the Round Table, Comics Connections to Medieval and Renaissance Literature. And that was my field, and it was super fun to write. Like I taught classes on comics and medieval and Renaissance literature, Shakespeare, Chaucer, Milton, Beowulf, the dead white guys, and some nuns. But then I also got to teach classes on Watchmen and superhero film. It was a wonderfully rewarding job. I loved doing it, but the academic job market is really terrible. And that was even before COVID, right? Which made everything even worse. And I spent 5 years at a small rural college on the Georgia coast, and I was just really unhappy there. And things kind of came to a head, and it was time to fish or cut bait, And a friend of mine who lives here in Seattle, she worked for Amazon, and she was also a former academic. She and I had gone to class together at UC Riverside, right? Did my PhD. And she'd been trying to argue to me for years that I should just get out of academia. Like, Jason, you should just make gaming your career instead of your hobby, right? Mm-hmm. And she sent me a job posting. Paizo was hiring for 2 jobs at that moment. They were hiring an editor, and they were hiring an organized play developer. Well, I didn't apply for the organized play developer because I did not have any experience with organized play, but I'd been doing nothing but editing student papers for 15 years. So I applied for an editing job, and eventually I got it. So, a few weeks later, I'm packing up my entire house and moving out here to Seattle. And I was an editor at Paizo for about a year and a half. And then a couple of people left the Star Chamber. That's what we call the Starfinder team. They left the Star Chamber. Chris Sims moved back to his family in Austria, and Owen Stevens and his wife LJ took a great opportunity, which I think took them to, I can't remember where, Minnesota? I can't remember. Anyway,
Indiana, I think.
Indiana. Yeah, you know this story.
Okay. I interviewed Owen on the show. Yeah.
Oh, very good. Wonderful. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, they both left the team. And so that meant that the Star Chamber was hiring 2 people. Well, thank God it was 2, because the other person that they hired was John Compton, who's been at Paizo running organized play for like 8 years, and I never would have beaten him in a resume. So if they hadn't hired 2, I wouldn't have been able to make the move. But they were hiring 2. So I went through a development test and an interview process, and I've been a developer on Starfinder since Gen Con last year, Gen Con 2019.
Okay. All right. Now, before I dive into your work at Paizo and on Starfinder and that, before I do that, I want to follow up with something because you had mentioned medieval literature and superheroes.
Yeah.
And so kind of my thing here with the Dice Geeks, .com podcast is that, I think that, experiencing stories and kind of all of its forms helps us become a better game master.
For sure.
And so when you talk about that, that kind of interests me. So what does medieval literature and superheroes have in common?
Well, okay, so never ask a grad student about his dissertation. This is the first lesson, Matt. You should really, if you get anything away from this interview, you should remember that statement, okay?
Okay.
But my argument is that superhero stories, whether they are comics or film or television or Broadway musicals or podcasts or whatever, because there are novels, there's every medium you can imagine for superhero stories now. That superhero stories are essentially romances. Now, I don't mean that in the sense of a romance novel. I'm not talking about young people falling in love romances, although there often is romance in a superhero story.
Sure.
What I mean is a romance in the sense of an Arthurian romance, in which the characters symbolize something, right? They are an allegory, and their actions are designed to teach people proper behavior. So when somebody does what's good, the universe rewards them. And when they do something that's not good, the universe punishes them for it, right? And Arthurian romances are not the original source of this. And there's a fantastic aspect to the romance as well. That is, they are literally fantastical. They're filled with magical or supernatural events. And there's a long history of the romance. And my argument is that if you have been reading superhero comics, you don't know this, but you have secretly been trained to be an expert reader of Arthurian literature, Spenser's Faerie Queene, Shakespeare, Beowulf, Chaucer, all of these other great medieval works, because they're all playing with a lot of the same ideas and themes and symbols. For example, a lot of these stories ultimately are about power. How do you use the power that you have? Now, in a medieval romance, those characters are knights, and they've got authority because they can kill people very easily, but also because they've been given some kind of justice authority where they're allowed to, dispense justice in the king's name or whatever. They have power over people. Well, but we also have power, right? Like you and I have power. Any one of us could ruin somebody else's life pretty easily with a few bad words, right? Like it's amazing sometimes when you think about it, how much power we have to make somebody else's life better or worse. And so when we read these superhero stories, which are often about the responsibility of power, okay, now you have all this power. What are you going to do with it? And can you control it? Can you control your power? In the medieval stories, this is often represented as a knight trying to struggle with his horse. The horse is the power. And when the horse throws the knight, that's the knight unable to control his own power, right? And there's I unpack this with a bunch of examples, but I'm just sort of, this is the rough and dirty version.
Sure.
So superheroes, you have characters like the Hulk and Spider-Man and Captain America and all these other characters, and they're all symbolic. They represent more than just themselves. When you've got a guy wandering around New York City and he's lost, he's just a dude lost in New York City. But when you put a red, white, and blue uniform on him and an A on his forehead, now he's America lost in New York City, right? And now it means something different. It's a story that's trying to tell you something. It's trying to say something. And so my argument was that medieval literature and superhero comics are in many ways talking about the same thing. And people who are good at reading one of them are also going to be really good at reading the other. Now, I had to do a lot of work on this project. I'm sorry again about my dogs. They're just going bananas. I had to do a lot of work on this project because when I wrote it, my audience was 3 old English professors who knew a lot about Shakespeare and nothing about superheroes. But when I rewrote it as a book, I flipped the audience. So now it's written for comics fans who know everything there is to know about Iron Man, Captain America, and Wonder Woman, but don't know anything about Spencer, Sidney, Shakespeare, Chaucer, or Thomas Mallory, right? Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. I think that these stories, the more exposure that we get to stories and storytelling, we find what works for us, and we find the stories that we personally want to tell. You know, we often say about these games, a lot of these role-playing games, that they're stories about killing monsters and taking their stuff. Okay, but they don't have to be about that, right? They can be about something bigger. They can be some kind of argument or statement or illumination of the human condition. They can be helping us to understand problems in our own society. They can just help us to build better relationships, right? The secret sauce of D&D and all the games that are based on it is that it's cooperative. That the wizard and the fighter and the cleric and the rogue, they can't win individually. They can only get through the dungeon if they all work together. Okay, that's saying something. That's a story that is inherently cooperative, and it builds relationships. It builds empathy and connection. And it's trying to say something about how we overcome problems. Anyway, I've gone off on a long tangent, and I apologize. But I'm hoping that this kind of gets you some idea of what I was sort of getting at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And no, I was listening very fascinatedly, actually, because I find it, I find kind of the connection between literature and the way we behave as individuals. I find that fascinating. And I think you can see it all the way back, right? I mean, the Greeks would have used Homer to figure out how they lived and so on, down the line.
Our understanding of these characters has changed over time, and the thing that we want out of them has changed. Like, traditionally, as a good example, traditionally the romance, and whether I'm talking about the Odyssey or King Arthur, or later romances like Orlando Furioso or something like that. The romantic hero, the character, the protagonist, is usually white, usually male, and usually aristocratic or upper class. They're fabulously rich and have all this power basically from birth. Okay, people today in America, we don't give about that stuff. We don't want, we can't identify with those characters very much anymore. We want somebody who's like working class. We want somebody who's an underdog. And so that's why Peter Parker becomes like the perfect superhero, right? Mm-hmm. Or at least extraordinarily popular. And Stan creates Stan and Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby and some other people who had their fingers in it, mm-hmm. create Peter Parker. And he's this nobody. Who gets power not because he asked for it, but because it was thrust upon him, if I can quote Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. And our readers go bananas over it, right? So I don't mean to suggest that these tropes are unbreakable or unmutable, because they're not. But the characters and the stories change over time as the audience's expectations and desires change. What we want out of our heroes has changed. And so now we get great stories like Black Panther, which, I just rewatched that film after Chadwick Boseman died. And that film was just so good, and it appealed to so many people, and it connected with so many people out there. And yet here he is. He's this king who's had everything he's ever wanted since birth, right? He's a classic mm-hmm. hero of the romance, except that he's Black. Mm-hmm. And it's just so awesome. And so there's a lot that is continuous back to medieval and ancient literature. But those stories are also changing in ways that are very important to our genre, to the genres, and to our hobby, and to our culture.
That is an interesting kind of point that you brought up there about the hero being kind of like rich and aristocratic. But then Peter Parker was just like an average teenager kind of thing. But I've seen, I mean, this is a little out of the box, but I've seen though the change though, where in maybe the 50s and 60s and 70s, perhaps even into the 80s, say with an 80s film like Karate Kid, where you know, in that movie, right, Daniel's mother is divorced and she's broke and moves to California or whatever. But say that, just keeping with that one for one example, the new Karate Kid, the remake, right? They're rich. the family of the Karate Kid is rich, and I just think, I mean, I don't know. That just kind of caught me as an interesting kind of thing that you were saying, that it seems like we're changing back from maybe a period of time when we wanted the poor hero, but now they're rich again.
But that movie bombed, man.
Yeah. Oh, it did. I know.
You know, so in other words, put yourself in the screenwriter's room where they're thinking, okay, how can we redo Karate Kid and make it different than the original? Yeah. Well, the protagonist's social status is an obvious place to go. But it didn't resonate with audiences. Like, the audience don't identify with that person, you know? Now, there is a certain amount of wish fulfillment. And, you know, Batman is a successful hero, and he's certainly not an underdog. He's got, you know, his superpower is his money. But what made Batman interesting was something different, right? Like the fact that he had a motivation. He had a reason to do what he was doing other than it's the right thing to do. Right? He had. Have you ever read The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay?
No, I have not.
It's a Pulitzer Prize winning novel by Michael Chabon, and it's about kind of the origin story of superhero comic books. It's a novel set in 1937 between this kind of Stan Lee kid and his cousin, who's kind of like Jack Kirby. And they're having this conversation as they're walking on the street, and they're brainstorming their own superhero. Superman has just come out. He's transforming the media landscape. Everybody's coming up with new superhero stories. And these two Jewish kids in New York, are brainstorming their own superhero. And as they're talking back and forth, there's a lot of swearing, so I won't duplicate the whole thing. But as they talk back and forth, one of them realizes, you know, we could invent any superhero. We can give him any weird animal powers. We can give him any superpower we want. What really matters is that he has the why. He has a reason to do what he's doing. What is the why? And of course, for Batman, it's okay. His parents were killed in front of him. He basically went insane, and he's never recovered. Oversimplification, but that's, you know, that's Chabon's. That's what comes out of the voice of these two Jewish kids. So this is suddenly the character has a motivation beyond, I have power, I must do what is good with it. And this is why Lancelot is so interesting to writers like Mallory, because he's trying to do what's good, but he has this conflicted motivation because he's also in love with his best friend's wife, right? And Batman has this motivation, and Peter has this motivation because he saw his uncle get killed, right? We've gone a long way from your Karate Kid metaphor, but I don't think that, to some extent, yes. To get back to your point, you suggested that I think we're seeing kind of the pendulum swing back, and audiences want wish fulfillment heroes again. Maybe. A lot of this was Downey Jr. was just so good as Tony Stark, Iron Man, right? And he established the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe, and he was filthy rich, had everything he wanted. And yet, the best parts of the Iron Man franchise are the parts when he's poor and has nothing, right? Like that whole middle part of the first movie, and the part in Iron Man 3 where he has to build weapons out of the Home Depot. And that's the part that everybody knows is the best part. And the super rich wish fulfillment part is the stuff that the movie actually really struggles to give meaning to. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. I just find it interesting because
Yeah.
I see that in quite a few films. Cause like if I was in another lifetime, I was a filmmaker, independent filmmaker. And,
Oh, right on.
I gave it up because I needed food. Right. So,
Well, you can go back to it one day, man. Like,
yeah. Well, yeah, maybe one day. We'll see. But, just thinking about some of the movies that I grew up on coming out of the 80s and the 90s and stuff, and just seeing, say, like, Karate Kid was one, but also, say, the last Starfighter. He's a broke kid living in a trailer park. It's just now, I just see so many movies where the kids are all rich. The young guys are all rich. They're all rich. And I just don't know if the audience has swung that way, or if it's just the way that those screenplays and stuff are getting produced. So I don't know. It's just kind of interesting.
Well, let me put out a theory, and we can test it. You can tell me if you think this is total bullshit or not.
Okay.
That these movies are influenced by the culture in which they're made and by the individuals that are making them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So somebody who grows up in the me generation of the 90s, or the Reagan era where greed is good, right? And we all saw Wall Street when we were kids, is going to grow up and make a movie that's maybe a reaction to that, or is going to mimic that, right? And right now we're living in a time where the difference in financial in social status between the very wealthy and the working class is as extreme as it's been in a very long time. And I think that as we value wealth or we don't value wealth, that impacts the films that get made in that moment. There's kind of a cultural zeitgeist, right, that movies try to seize a hold of and ride. So I guess I'm coming around to your point of view. I think, that it does kind of swing back and forth, but I think that those swings are influenced by what people are talking about day to day in their daily lives in our country.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there is something to what you were saying there. I think it is interesting to kind of look up, if you look up some directors who have directed some recent movies and things like that. A lot of them, grew up in Malibu. A lot of them, a lot of them grew up, in Manhattan. And I know there's a lot made of kind of the democratization of technology that anybody now can make a movie on an iPhone and things like that. But I think there is something to what you were saying there, because I think you do see, a lot of people who are making movies now are like, well, this was me when I was a kid. I grew up, in mansions and things, instead of perhaps a lot of people who were making movies, kind of ending up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They started out in other places and they were broke when they were kids, and then they, became successful later in life. I think
there's kind of an argument here that when someone makes a movie in which the protagonist is super wealthy, or that it becomes a kind of way to soothe the anxieties and pressures of a culture that is struggling with this issue. In other words, if we're having trouble paying our bills, we'll go to watch a movie for 2 hours to just forget our pressures and to see a protagonist on the screen and imagine that is us, right? That it's a kind of a escape valve for social pressure. But the other version of it is where, instead of trying to avoid these issues in our society, the filmmaker decides to spotlight them. And so, we get, I'll just pick a show like Stranger Things, right? Where everybody on Stranger Things is pretty working class. You've got, a single mom and a single dad, and with pretty ordinary jobs. People are working at the mall, in fast food jobs. And there's a lot of nostalgia in a lot of these shows, where the filmmaker or the showrunner is calling back to an earlier time, and they either want to dramatize it and make it more real, which usually means poorer, or they want to glamorize it and make it more wish fulfillment.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah, no, and I probably derailed the whole conversation.
For those of you who are now listening to a film podcast.
And yes, socioeconomic influence of film from the 1980s to whenever. No, I just found it fascinating. And when you mentioned that, it's just something that I think about sometimes, because I know, just some of the... I don't know, just some of those protagonists from the kind of the 1980s films, and that you were just able, or at least I was, just able to really identify with them really quickly. And then nowadays, I'll turn on, some action movie or something like this, and the kid is being bullied, but he's also driving a Viper or something. I'm just like, okay, I don't know this kid. I don't know anything about him or why he would be being bullied if he's driving a Viper to school.
I think maybe I think America really loves its underdogs, right? Mm-hmm. And so if they're not coming from a social class that makes them underdogs, we have to find something else about them to make them underdogs instead.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. And and sorry if I derailed the whole thing. I just thought that was fascinating. And I think you can definitely look at that when you're running games and when you're creating characters for games. I think, thinking about your character's background, is always interesting, whether they come from, wealth and now they're on the road as a penniless adventurer. That could be a very interesting twist, as well as the son of the peasants who's now risen to be, an adventurer or something like that. Well, I think there's a lot of interesting detail that can be built in when you're role playing there.
It's interesting in our hobby because the pursuit of wealth has been baked into our hobby since the earliest days of D&D, right?
Yeah.
It's been assumed that the reason why player characters do things is to get money, is to get rich. And this often has really weird side effects where the characters are poor at first level, or they have enough money to buy their weapons and armor, and then they buy a week's worth of trail rations and they're out of money, right?
Yeah.
But after a relatively short amount of adventuring, 3 or 4 levels of adventuring, they are now the wealthiest people in town, right? Or at least the wealthiest people in the village.
Yeah.
And they rapidly sort of lose all sense of proportion regarding their wealth. And they become kind of fantastically wealthy. But because they still only have enough money to buy the next magic item, they don't feel rich.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm kind of getting into games that try to set aside that pursuit of wealth as the objective of the game. It's a great motivator, don't get me wrong. And as a GM writer, it's nice to be able to just say, okay, if you do this thing, you'll get a reward of 50,000 credits or gold pieces or whatever. That's a very nice shorthand motivation. Mm-hmm. But I think that I would, as a game maker, I would prefer to have stories where the money is a side issue and it's not why we're doing what we're doing. Maybe we need it because I like writing stories about working class heroes who are relatable by my audience. We have to get paid. We have to pay rent, and we're not good. We're not doing this good thing to get the money to pay rent. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do, and we have the power to make it better. Mm-hmm. But we're also keeping our eye out for rent because we also have to pay rent.
Yeah,
I find that better. I don't want it to be the primary motivator of my heroes, but I like it as a little sauce that I sprinkle on.
Yeah, and I think it's the Barbarians of Lemuria. I think that role-playing game, your adventurers want to gather all this wealth, but then you don't get experience points unless you party it all away. because if you went out and find this this ancient lost treasure that's like almost priceless, with an emerald the size of your head or something, and you come back to society, well, you would be rich, you would throw some money in the bank, start businesses, whatever, do this stuff. But if so you would have no reason to go back out on another adventure. So what they do is say, well, you don't get experience points if you do that. So if you party it all away, well, guess what? You need more money. So you have to go on another adventure. So I think
what game was this again?
The Barbarians of Lemuria.
Oh, well, one of the reasons why that rule is like that is because that's exactly what Conan does.
Yes.
Right? Conan is constantly gaining wealth, and then he promptly just blows it all as soon as he gets to town.
Yeah.
So it's totally in genre. So now you create a rule that encourages the players to play the genre, which is good rule. That's a good system.
Yeah. I thought that was funny when I was reading that one. But now, we had talked about your work at Paizo just a little bit. Sure. What have you done for Paizo? So,
by the time you listen to this podcast, my first adventure path, which I was the lead developer on, will be partway out, and that is Fly, Free, or Die. And it's going to sound very familiar to everybody who's been listening to this show so far, because it's about a lot of things we've been talking about. Fly, Free, or Die is a 6-volume adventure path for Starfinder that starts at level 1 and goes up to level 13. And it's about a starship crew with their own starship, and they are just trying to do the job and get paid, right? They are trying to live an independent life in a galaxy where everything has a price. And they are pursued by an evil corporation and a crime boss. And it's kind of a callback to a lot of the classic sci-fi tropes, not just something like Firefly or Serenity, but to the same things that Firefly and Serenity were also borrowing from, like Traveler, or even Eve to some extent, if anybody plays Eve. Mm-hmm. This is not a story about saving the galaxy. This is a story about paying rent. And I did that on purpose because I wanted the characters to be relatable, and I wanted the problems to be stuff that the people would relate to. And as you go through this adventure path, you meet a lot of characters, and how you treat them is really important. So if you treat these characters well, if you respect them and treat them like people, then they will return that. But if you treat them like marks, or they're nothing but a source of currency for you, if you're just there to collect your pay and go on, then they're going to treat you the same way. And so there's a lot of room there for the player characters acting as model behavior for the NPCs in the adventure path, who will follow the player character's lead on how they choose to act. And eventually, when I pitched this campaign, this adventure path, to my bosses, to Rob, my creative director, and to Eric Mona, the publisher, I described it as rags to riches to ruined to revenge, right? So you start off poor, you get everything, then you lose everything, and then you get vengeance on the people that done you wrong, right? And so there's a lot of action adventure stuff. Starfinder is an action adventure game, and so there's still plenty of that. There's a lot of space action, lots of visiting planets and doing jobs. But there's also, I think, some opportunity there for us to maybe ask ourselves, how should we behave in these tough situations, right? When the going gets tough, can you do what's right? Or do you just do what seems easiest and most practical? What I have found in my experience is that doing what is right almost always means doing what is hard. Mm-hmm. And this adventure path is designed to ask that question of you. And let's see what your answer is. So the first volume publishes in November, which should be a couple of months ago by the time that you hear this. Mm-hmm. And it runs for 6 months. And that was my first big project. I've been on the Star Chamber, like I say, since about August of 2019. But for a lot of that time, I was developing back matter material that had already been contracted and outlined and assigned, and so was turned in to me. And I was helping out Jason Keeley, my coworker and friend, as he developed the Threefold Conspiracy Adventure Path, and then the Devastation Arc Adventure Path, and Fly, Fear, or Die is the first adventure path after Devastation Arc. And then, in addition, I've been doing a lot of writing. I do a lot of freelance game writing. So I wrote The Show Must Go On, which is the first volume of the Extinction Curse adventure path for Pathfinder 2nd edition. That's the one where everybody plays circus performers, if you are following Pathfinder. So I got to write that adventure path, and I've written a couple of adventure paths for Starfinder along the way, and I've got a lot more in the works. And I was able to contribute to various Pathfinder and Starfinder books along the way, some of which we have announced and some of which we have not. I think we've announced Secrets of Magic for Pathfinder 2nd edition, so I got to contribute to that. And some books for Starfinder that haven't been announced yet. Although when I'm recording this, they haven't been announced. They probably have been announced by the time you've heard this, but I can't jump the gun on that.
No, that sounds fantastic. And and I have to say, I kind of like what you said there when you said that your adventure path wasn't about like saving the galaxy.
Yeah.
I like stories like that as well. I think some years ago when I would play a lot of West End Star Wars game, we would play smugglers and their co-pilots, and the saving the galaxy kind of took the back seat to honestly,
Edge of Empire is the most popular Star Wars game of those three, the Fantasy Flight books. And there's a reason why they published Edge of Empire first, because everybody knew that playing Han Solo is the best part of Star Wars, right?
Yep.
If you liked Edge of Empire, if you like the gritty sci-fi of Firefly or even the Aliens franchise, there's a lot. When I wrote the outline for this adventure path, there's a long intro where I speak directly to my authors and I say, look, this is a James Cameron movie. This adventure path is a James Cameron movie. And whether it's Avatar or Aliens or even Titanic or Terminator 2, Cameron has a lot to say about the struggles of the working class as opposed to the rich. That rich people just don't understand. They're like another species. They just don't understand what ordinary people are like. And his protagonists are working class people, and they're soldiers or veterans or people working crummy day jobs, and that's all very important to this adventure path. The Abyss, another great example, a bunch of basically oil miners on the bottom of the ocean, right?
Yeah.
At Fly, Fear, or Die is a James Cameron movie series. Yeah.
No, it sounds fantastic, and that is a kind of an interesting way to frame it, and especially from what we were talking about earlier.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It was, and it's funny though in Starfinder, because Starfinder is a classic example of that problem that I mentioned, where by the time you hit 5th or 6th level, you are like richer than Abadar, right? Like you're fantastically wealthy. But that's because buying a laser pistol costs you 10,000 credits, right?
Yeah.
So it's really weird the way that we kind of lose track of money, and the numbers get so high. It's just an aspect of the game system.
Yeah.
So that meant that we had some real challenges in the adventure path, because we play for the first couple of volumes. It's very much like, okay, we're trying to do the job and get paid, right? And we need the money to keep the ship flying, and we're just trying to kind of make it one day at a time. But that doesn't really hold up very well when the characters hit like 7th, 9th, 10th level, right? Like you're not working class characters anymore. You're more important. So we had to so the storyline had to change, and it had to become about different things, right? So now you lose it all. Now you're down and out on Absalom Station, and you have got nothing. Your ship is gone. You've got nothing except that laser pistol that you bought for 10,000 credits, right? But But how do you? But there are no laser pistols in the world that will get you from where you are to the place where you need to be. So how do you do that? How do you get there? And it becomes this personal challenge where, okay, I've got to call in all these old favors of all these people that I've met over the last 4 volumes of the Adventure Path so that I can get an alliance together of the people I need to get me from point A to point B that I can't do without help. And if I've alienated all those people along the way, instead of befriending them, if I have made all those people into my enemies, well, this adventure just got a lot harder, right?
Yeah. No, it sounds fantastic.
It should be fun. I'm looking forward to it. But when I hear this interview replayed, I'm going to be either ecstatic because it's gone well, or I'm going to be crying in my beer. So let's hope it's the former.
Yeah. Let's hope. Besides James Cameron and maybe Firefly, did you draw any inspiration from some other sources?
Well, I played Traveler when I was a young gamer. It was actually one of the first games that I encountered other than D&D. And if you remember Traveler, did you ever play it?
No, I haven't. I read the first book, but I have not ever got to play it. I want to.
Well, it's impossible to recapture this moment. It was very much part of the late 70s, early 80s. But you unfold the map for Traveler, and it's this massive black map covered with hexes. And in half of these hexes, there are little dots that represent a star and little names of all of these star systems, right? And symbols around the star that tell you if it's got a military base or whatever. And then there would be this little book that gives nothing but a list of numbers for every one of those stars. And Traveler had this system where you would codify a planet's economy and population size and what its government was like and everything with this numerical system. So you would have this string of like 10 or 12 numbers in a row with no like strength, dexterity, none of that. Just a long list of 12 numbers. And you had to decode the numbers to figure out some idea of what this planet was like. And there were thousands of these planets on this map. And the first adventure was like, okay, you have been hired to survey all of these planets. Like you literally are just going from planet to planet to planet hopping, planet of the week kind of storytelling. Mm-hmm. And maybe you are hiring cargo, and you're picking up cargo on one planet and taking it to somewhere else and trying to sell it, trying to buy low, sell high, right? Mm-hmm. And you had all these rules for the economics of starships, like how much does it cost for me to maintain my starship day to day? How much does it cost me to buy fuel? How do I buy repair and maintenance? If I want to improve my starship, how do I do that? Like how many credits do I need to buy a new laser rifle or turret and to improve the shields or make the jump engine go farther or whatever? And tables for generating random cargoes, right? So like I go to the marketplace and I want to I'm looking for cargo to ship. Well, what is that cargo and how much does it cost for you to buy it? And what's the plot development that comes along with it, right? Like all of this like incredible sandbox adventure where the player characters are looking at a giant map and just told, go wherever you want. Mm-hmm. And that's not what an AP is about. An AP is structured. That's the whole reason why you're buying the AP is for the story. Mm-hmm. But we tried to give it as much of that it's Tuesday, so this must be Rigel kind of picaresque storytelling where you're on a new planet, like you visit like 3 or 4 different planets in the course of just one volume of this adventure. Always getting some new connection to the next planet, right? And so there's a lot of old school Traveler in there, and I was trying to capture kind of a lot of that classic sci-fi. It's still weird because it's Starfinder, so there's still magic everywhere and crazy aliens and all that kind of stuff. But the idea that you are that you're a crew of your own starship just trying to kind of break even, and maybe one day not have to answer to anybody, that there will be nobody breathing down your neck and telling you what to do except you. And that's why it's called Fly Free or Die, right? Like that's kind of the idea behind it. There's a lot of other influences, but that's some of it. I listen to a lot of Bruce Springsteen. I'll tell you what, for this AP, I have a Spotify playlist for this AP that I listened to while I was developing it, and there's a lot of like work songs on it, like crop picking songs, cotton picking songs, hammer songs, like in the John Henry style.
Okay.
Lots of songs about work. 9 to 5 is on there. Like any song that we did that you can think of that's about like working the day job, pretty much got onto my playlist.
Nice.
And it's my dad was a union guy. He worked as a sheet metal mechanic my whole life, and it was a good union job. He worked in a fabrication shop, and those jobs are hard to find now. But there's a lot to be said about there's some virtue to good, honest, hard work. A day's work for a day's pay. There's something honorable in that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of heroes that Fly Free or Die is about.
Mm-hmm. That sounds fantastic, because I think that kind of aesthetic captures kind of some of that whole the independent crew working their ship, and they just want to be free.
Yeah, I
kind
hope
of whole
so.
thing.
I hope so. It's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see, because some players aren't going to want to deal with any of that, and some players will get distracted because there's so much other stuff going on in Starfinder. There's crazy aliens and rocket ships and robots and dragons and wizards and stuff. And so a lot of these themes, you just don't really pay any attention to them. But I'm a strong believer in the idea that we can learn while we are having fun, that we can be entertained playing a game, and yet also maybe be exposed to ideas that we haven't thought about before. And often that education, that impact, is completely subconscious. We don't even think about what's going on, but when it's over, we realize that we liked this particular character and we really love them, and we get attached to them, and we don't even know why. And the answer is because that character helped us to learn something about ourselves and about people in the world around us. And we can't even articulate that. We just know that it affected us somehow. And so we grab onto that character. We'll see what happens. I hope people like it.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right when you talk about that. Like the games then help us learn things as well.
Yeah.
Even just thinking about different people, of course, different situations, different, stations in society and things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think those are very clear. But I mean, I also just remember back to playing Dungeons and Dragons when, I was 13 and I struggled with reading when I was in school. Well, I'm sitting in my room reading tons of material because I want to play Dungeons and Dragons. So it helped me become a better reader. Math. I'm doing math problems voluntarily. I mean, who does that? Right? It's because I'm playing a game.
Yeah, totally. Like I was terrible at math. I loved to read, but I hated math, and yet I would spend days working through the GURPS random star system generator, which involved pretty complicated math because it was all designed to be astronomically correct, right? Like it would create stars and planets with atmospheres and biomes based on what we knew about science at the time. Mm-hmm. And so it's like a ton of, you can't do it without calculator, right? Like and it's very laborious and slow. And I would work my way through all that stuff for days, and I would call that a good time.
Yeah.
It's crazy what we'll do for our hobby sometimes.
No kidding.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Jason, I could probably go on just asking you more and more questions.
We could talk all day.
I know we could talk all day. But I should let you go at some point. So Jason, right before we go, where can people find your adventure path for Starfinder and some of the other books that you've worked on?
Well, we're probably still in COVID lockdown as you hear about this, but if you can go to your local game store, I really encourage you to do it. They need your business. And maybe they've got arrangements made where you can go in and you can still be safe. But if you are away from a game store or you don't have one, all of this stuff is available on PDF and from the Paizo store, paizo.com. And it's also on your tabletop simulators like Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds, where all of that stuff comes preloaded. So you can literally run the entire Flat for Your Die Adventure Path without doing any of the work, using the adventures and maps and tokens and character sheets and everything that are all preloaded on Fantasy Grounds or Roll20. So give that a shot. I say this because I've been using Fantasy Grounds myself, and it's a game changer. I've never been really hip with online gaming. I much prefer to play my games around a table with my friends. But COVID is COVID, and we do what we have to do. And I'll tell you, running a game when you have all of these virtual tools at your fingertips is pretty damn cool, and it makes everything run a lot faster, which is not nothing. So anyway, yeah. But listen, I'd love to come back sometime and carry on where we left off. If you get a chance.
Yeah, absolutely. And
okay,
then I was.
Great.
Yeah, and then I was going to mention as well that I will provide links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening right now can go over to dicegeeks.com and they can find the links and to Jason's Adventure Path and to some of the books that he has worked on.
Yeah, and I'm on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Comics. Send me a note. I love to. If I can. I love to talk gaming with anybody, so I'm an easy sell.
All right. I'll put a link in the show notes for your Twitter as well. Right. And then, I'd love to have you back on again, but just thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure.
All right. There you have it, guys. Oh, I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jason today. It was a ton of fun to get to talk to him. Now, as I mentioned, I have provided links to some of the games that Jason has worked on in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So head over there, check those out. Now, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you will get an email update from me letting you know what I am up to here in the world of Dice Geeks. Now, hey guys, I really appreciate you listening to the show. I hope you enjoy these interviews that I do each and every Wednesday. If you would consider supporting the show in some way, I would greatly appreciate it. You can like, subscribe, review, rate. Did I say rate already? Whatever. You can do all of that where you are listening to this podcast right now. Ratings and reviews help the show immensely. So if you like these episodes, please consider doing that. Also, if you would like to support the show financially, you can head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and learn how to support the show there. Now, guys, like I said, I thank you so much for listening. And until next Wednesday, keep gaming.